Gunslinger swore to never kill again, until he saw her auctioned like a dog. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Ridge as Samuel Morrison struck his hammer against the glowing horseshoe, each blow echoing like a gunshot in the desert air. Sweat beaded on his weathered brow despite the early hour, and his calloused hands, once steady enough to draw faster than death itself, now found their purpose in honest work. "Easy there, Sam," called out Mayor Henderson from the boardwalk, adjusting his spectacles as he watched the rhythmic pounding. "That poor iron's already surrendered." Sam paused mid-swing, his steel-gray eyes meeting the mayor's concerned gaze. At 42, the former gunslinger's face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much, his dark hair now streaked with premature silver. The twin Colt .45s that once rode his hips had been locked away in a chest beneath his bed for 5 long years, gathering dust like forgotten ghosts. "Just keeping busy, Mayor," Sam replied, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent years shouting orders over gunfire and chaos. "Idle hands and all that." Henderson nodded knowingly. The whole town was aware of Sam's history, how the legendary Deadeye Morrison had arrived in Redemption Ridge like a wounded animal seeking shelter, hanging up his guns after what folks whispered was a terrible accident back in Tombstone. Nobody pressed for details, and Sam preferred it that way. The blacksmith shop occupied a corner lot where Main Street intersected with Desert Rose Avenue, its wide doors opening onto both thoroughfares. From his anvil, Sam could observe the daily rhythm of frontier life. Merchants hawking their wares, children chasing chickens through the dusty streets, and travelers pausing to water their horses at the community trough. It was honest, simple living, everything his former life hadn't been. "You heard about the commotion down at the railroad depot?" Henderson asked, lowering his voice as he stepped closer to the forge. The red glow from the coals painted worried shadows across his face. Sam's hammer stilled completely. "What kind of commotion?" "Word is Blackwood's people are bringing in another shipment today." Henderson spat into the dirt, his disgust evident. "Labor contracts, they call them. But you and I both know what that really means. Theodore Blackwood owned the Southwest Continental Railroad and most of the land rights stretching from Redemption Ridge to the California border. A man of considerable wealth and absolutely no conscience, he'd built his empire on the backs of desperate people, immigrants, debtors, anyone unlucky enough to fall into his web of contracts and legal schemes. "Not my business," Sam said firmly, returning to his work with renewed intensity. The horseshoe sparked and rang under his assault, but his jaw was set in a hard line. "Sam, they're selling people like livestock down there. Families torn apart, children. I said it's not my business." The words came out harsher than intended, causing Henderson to step back. Sam immediately regretted his tone but couldn't take it back. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the hammer, the weight of his past pressing down like a physical burden. The mayor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Sam, but sometimes a man's business finds him whether he wants it or not." As Henderson walked away, Sam tried to focus on his work, but the old familiar feeling was creeping back, that itch between his shoulder blades that used to warn him of approaching danger. He'd learned to trust that instinct during his years as a bounty hunter, when it had kept him alive through countless showdowns and ambushes. The morning crowd began to thicken as word spread about Blackwood's arrival. Sam watched from his forge as townspeople hurried toward the depot, some out of morbid curiosity, others hoping to find cheap labor for their businesses. He told himself he wouldn't look, wouldn't get involved, wouldn't break the sacred promise he'd made at a small grave outside Tombstone 5 years ago. But when the church bell tolled 10 o'clock and the distant sound of shouting voices carried on the desert wind, Sam found himself setting aside his tools. His legs carried him toward the crowd as if moving of their own accord, drawn by a compulsion stronger than his willpower. The railroad depot sat at the eastern edge of town, a modest wooden structure that served as Redemption Ridge's connection to the outside world. A special train had arrived that morning. Not the usual passenger service, but a series of freight cars modified with barred windows and reinforced doors. The sight made Sam's stomach clench with recognition. He'd seen similar arrangements during the war, transporting prisoners and supplies. But this was different. This was wrong in a way that made his trigger finger itch despite his sworn oath. Blackwood stood on a makeshift platform constructed from railroad ties and planks, his expensive suit immaculate despite the desert heat. The man was in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked upon. Beside him, his foreman, Jake Sullivan, a brute with scarred knuckles and a perpetual sneer, kept order among the crowd with casual threats and intimidating glares. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood called out in his practiced orator's voice, "today we offer an opportunity for mutual benefit. These individuals have entered into legal contracts for labor services, and we're transferring those contracts to local employers. All arrangements are completely within territorial law." Sam pushed closer through the crowd, his height advantage allowing him to see over most heads. What he witnessed next would be burned into his memory forever. A group of perhaps 20 people, clearly immigrants and debtors, being led from the train cars like livestock. They were dirty, frightened, and obviously malnourished from their journey. Among them, one figure caught his attention immediately. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long, dark hair that caught the sunlight despite its unwashed state. Her clothes, once a simple but well-made dress, were torn and stained, but she held her head high with a defiance that reminded Sam painfully of his younger sister Maria, who died in the cholera outbreak of '76. The young woman's eyes, dark and fierce, swept across the crowd with undisguised contempt. When Blackwood's men tried to position her with the others, she jerked away from their touch, earning a sharp cuff across the head that made Sam's hands involuntarily clench into fists. "This here's Elena Vasquez," Sullivan announced, grabbing the woman's arm despite her attempts to pull away. Young, strong, good with languages, perfect for domestic work or other arrangements. His leering grin made several men in the crowd chuckle appreciatively. Elena spat something in rapid Spanish that made even the Mexican workers in the crowd look uncomfortable. Sam caught enough to understand she was questioning Sullivan's parentage in very creative terms. "Spirited little filly, ain't she?" Blackwood called out, drawing more laughter from the assembled crowd. "Now what am I bid for this 5-year contract?" And there it was, the moment that would shatter Sam Morrison's carefully constructed peace forever. As the bids began flying and Elena Vasquez stood defiant but helpless on that platform, something broke inside the former gunslinger's chest. The promise he'd made to never kill again warred with an older, deeper oath, the one he'd sworn to his dying sister to always protect the innocent. His right hand twitched toward his hip, finding empty air where his guns used to rest. But the gesture wasn't lost on him, nor was its meaning. The auction continued around him, but Sam heard it as if from a great distance, his mind already racing toward a decision that would change everything. The bidding started at $50, the price of a good horse or a month's wages for most working men. Sam watched in horrified fascination as local businessmen and ranchers raised their hands, treating Elena Vasquez like prime livestock at a county fair. "60, called out Marcus Webb, who owned the largest saloon in town. His intentions were clear from the hungry look in his bloodshot eyes. "75, countered Dutch Morrison, no relation to Sam despite the shared name. The cattle rancher needed workers for his spread, but his reputation for cruelty toward his Mexican hands was well known throughout the territory. Elena stood rigid on the platform, her dark eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. When her gaze met Sam's, he saw something that cut him to the bone. Not fear exactly, but a desperate resignation that reminded him too much of the expression he'd seen on dying men's faces during the war. $100. The voice belonged to Dr. Calvin Pierce, the town's physician. At first, Sam felt a spark of hope. Pierce was a decent man who might treat her fairly. But then he noticed Mrs. Pierce's absence and remembered the rumors about the doctor's drinking problem since his wife's death. Jake Sullivan prodded Elena with a wooden rod, forcing her to turn around slowly so the bidders could examine her from all angles. The degradation of it made Sam's vision blur with rage. His sister Maria had been proud, independent, full of life and laughter. Seeing another young woman reduced to this was like watching Maria's memory being desecrated. "Do I hear 120? Blackwood called out, his voice smooth as snake oil. "This is a prime specimen, gentlemen. Young, healthy, and spirited enough to provide entertainment for the right owner." The crowd's laughter made Sam sick. He pushed forward through the press of bodies, not sure what he intended to do, but knowing he couldn't just stand there. A restraining hand fell on his shoulder. Mayor Henderson, who'd somehow found him in the crowd. "Don't do anything stupid, Sam," the mayor whispered urgently. This is all legal, unfortunately. Blackwood's got territorial judges in his pocket, and causing trouble here will just get you arrested or killed. Legal doesn't make it right, Sam growled, his voice barely audible over the continuing auction. $150! Dutch Morrison's voice boomed across the depot. The rancher's cruel smile promised nothing good for Elena's future. Henderson's grip tightened on Sam's shoulder. I know how you feel, but think about what you're considering. You've built a good life here. Don't throw it away for what? For doing the right thing? Sam's eyes never left Elena's face as she stood trembling with fury rather than fear. Tell me, Mayor, what's the point of a good life if you stand by and watch evil happen? Before Henderson could respond, a new voice cut through the crowd like a blade through silk. $200. The entire depot fell silent. That kind of money could feed a family for 6 months or buy a small homestead. Heads turned to locate the bidder, and Sam felt his blood run cold when he saw who had spoken. Captain James Rourke stood at the back of the crowd, his blue cavalry uniform immaculate despite the dust and heat. The man was a legend in these parts, a Civil War hero who'd stayed in Arizona territory to fight Apache raiders and maintain order along the Mexican border. But Sam knew things about Rourke that the general public didn't. Dark rumors from his bounty hunting days about what happened to young women who disappeared near Army outposts. Ah, Captain Rourke. Blackwood's voice carried genuine pleasure. Always a pleasure doing business with a representative of law and order. Elena's defiance finally cracked when she saw Rourke. Her face went pale, and for the first time since stepping off that train, real fear entered her eyes. She obviously knew the captain's reputation, and whatever she'd heard had terrified her more than anything else in this nightmare. $250! Dutch Morrison called out desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone knew he couldn't match Rourke's government salary and side businesses. $300, Rourke said calmly, not even bothering to raise his voice. The finality in his tone suggested he was prepared to go much higher if necessary. Sam felt something snap inside his chest, not break, but realign, like bones setting after a fracture. The promise he'd made 5 years ago suddenly seemed less important than the oath he'd sworn to his sister's memory. Some things were worth breaking vows for. $500. The words left Sam's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. The entire crowd turned to stare at the blacksmith who'd just bid more money than most of them saw in a year. Mayor Henderson's face went white with shock. Sam, what are you doing? The mayor hissed. But Sam wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked on Elena's face, watching hope and confusion war in her expression. She didn't know who he was or why he was bidding, but she could see that he was different from the other men, something in his weathered features that spoke of honor rather than avarice. Blackwood's eyebrows rose with interest. $500 from the town blacksmith. My, mister. Morrison? I had no idea your forge was so profitable. Captain Rourke turned slowly to study Sam, his pale eyes calculating. The two men had never met directly, but reputations traveled fast in the territory. After a long moment, Rourke's mouth curved into a cold smile. $600, he said quietly. The crowd gasped. That was serious money, enough to buy a good piece of land or start a legitimate business. Sam felt sweat beading on his forehead as he calculated his life savings. The money he'd scraped together from 5 years of blacksmithing, supplemented by the modest fortune he'd accumulated during his bounty hunting days, might be enough, but just barely. $700, Sam called out, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. Rourke's smile widened. $800. The numbers were getting ridiculous now. Elena stared at Sam with growing amazement, clearly wondering why a complete stranger would bankrupt himself for her freedom. Even Blackwood looked surprised by the escalating bids. Sam's mind raced through his options. He had maybe $900 hidden in his cabin, everything he owned in the world. If he bid it all and Rourke went higher, he'd be left with nothing. But if he walked away now, he looked at Elena again, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, and made his choice. $1,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as every person in the crowd processed what they'd just heard. $1,000 was a fortune, enough to buy a small ranch or live comfortably for several years. Captain Rourke studied Sam for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh, a cold, humorless sound that raised goosebumps on Sam's arms. "You know what, Mr. Morrison?" Rourke said finally. "I admire your generosity. The girl is yours." Relief flooded through Sam so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. But something in Rourke's tone suggested this wasn't over, that the captain had simply decided to let Sam have his victory while planning something else entirely. "Sold," Blackwood declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. $1,000 to Mr. Samuel Morrison. Please settle your account with my associate, Mr. Sullivan." As Sam pushed through the crowd toward the platform, Elena's eyes never left his face. He could see questions there. Who was he? Why had he done this? What did he want from her? But beneath the questions was something else. A flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was about to end. If only Sam could be sure he wasn't about to make it worse. The walk back to Sam's cabin felt like the longest mile of his life. Elena Vasquez walked 3 paces behind him, her wrists still bearing the rope burns from her captivity, her torn dress rustling against the desert wind. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the depot, but Sam could feel the weight of her suspicious gaze boring into his back. His modest cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the town, surrounded by a few scraggly mesquite trees and a vegetable garden that had seen better days. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small stable for his horse. But it was honest shelter, earned through sweat and toil rather than blood and violence. Sam pushed open the wooden door and gestured for Elena to enter, but she remained frozen on the threshold, her dark eyes scanning the interior as if looking for traps or weapons. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "You can sit," Sam said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm not going to hurt you." Elena's laugh was bitter as desert alkali. "That is what they all say, senor, before they show you what they really want." Her English was accented but precise, speaking to an education that made her current circumstances all the more tragic. Sam watched as she finally stepped inside, noting how she positioned herself near the door, ready to run if necessary. "My name is Samuel Morrison," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a wooden peg. "Most folks just call me Sam. I know who you are." Elena's voice carried a note of recognition that made Sam's blood run cold. Even in Mexico, we heard stories of the famous Deadeye Morrison, the gunfighter who could kill a man at 100 paces. Sam winced. His reputation had traveled farther than he'd realized. "That was a long time ago. I don't do that anymore." "No?" Elena crossed her arms, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes. "Then why did you spend $1,000 on me? What does a retired killer want with a Mexican girl?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Sam sank into his only chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. How could he explain about Maria? About the promise he'd made and broken? About the weight of guilt that had driven him to this godforsaken town in search of redemption? "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "Someone I couldn't protect." Elena's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. "Your wife?" "My sister." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Her name was Maria. She died in the cholera outbreak of '76 back in El Paso. I was off chasing some outlaw for the bounty money. Thought I'd be back before winter." Sam's hands clenched into fists. By the time I returned, she'd been in the ground for 3 weeks. Understanding flickered in Elena's eyes, but she didn't speak. Outside, the afternoon heat shimmered off the desert floor like liquid glass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the sky. "I swore an oath at her graveside," Sam continued. "Said I'd never let anyone hurt an innocent person if I had the power to stop it. Then 5 years ago, I broke that oath in the worst possible way." He looked up at Elena, seeing his sister's defiant spirit reflected in her face. "I killed a child by mistake, a little boy who got caught in crossfire during a gunfight in Tombstone. After that, I put away my guns and swore I'd never take another life." Elena moved closer, her earlier suspicion replaced by something that might have been compassion. "But today you were ready to break that second oath for me. Why?" "Because some things are worth more than promises," Sam said. "And because letting you go to Captain Rourke would have been another kind of murder." At the mention of Rourke's name, Elena's face went pale. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to ward off a chill despite the desert heat. "You know what he does to women like me," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded grimly. During his bounty hunting days, He'd heard whispers about army officers who used their authority to acquire young women for their personal enjoyment. Most were careful to keep such activities away from civilian populations, but rumors had a way of traveling along the frontier's informal networks. "How did you end up on that train?" Sam asked gently. Elena was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated grief. "My father owned a small farm outside Tucson. Good land, with a well and fruit trees, but the railroad wanted to put tracks through our property." She sat down on Sam's simple wooden cot, her hands twisting in her lap. When Papa refused to sell, they found ways to make life difficult. Cattle mysteriously died, crops failed due to accidental dam breaks upstream, bandits attacked our workers. Sam had heard similar stories before. The railroads had enormous power in the territory, and men like Blackwood weren't particular about their methods when acquiring land. Papa tried to fight them in court, but we didn't have money for good lawyers. Blackwood's people buried us in legal fees until we couldn't afford to keep fighting. Elena's voice grew harder. When they finally foreclosed on the farm, Papa couldn't stand the shame. He took his own life. "Jesus," Sam breathed. "I'm sorry. Mama and I tried to start over in Tucson, but Blackwood's influence reaches everywhere. No one would hire the daughter of the man who caused trouble for the railroad. We ran out of money, couldn't pay our debts." Elena's hands trembled slightly. "That's when Blackwood's men came with their contracts. They said we could work off what we owed, that it would only be for a few years. But once you signed, you belonged to them." See, the single word carried a lifetime of bitterness. "They separated me from my mother at the first stop. Said she was too old for the kind of work they had in mind for me. I don't even know if she's still alive." Sam felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in the Southwest. But this time the anger was tempered by something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in 5 long years. "What will you do now?" Elena asked. "You spent everything you had on my freedom. How will you survive?" It was a good question, and one Sam hadn't fully considered in his desperate bid to save her. His life savings were gone, handed over to Sullivan in a mixture of paper money and silver coins that represented 5 years of honest labor. All he had left was his blacksmith shop and the skills that had once made him legendary. "I'll figure something out," he said. "The important thing is that you're free now. You can go wherever you want, start a new life." Elena studied his weathered face for a long moment. "You would do that? Let me leave after what you sacrificed? Your freedom isn't conditional on staying here. I didn't buy you, I bought your contract and I'm tearing it up." To prove his point, Sam walked to the fireplace and retrieved the legal document Sullivan had given him. Without hesitation, he tossed it into the cold ashes. "You don't owe me anything." For the first time since he'd seen her on that platform, Elena Vasquez smiled. It transformed her face completely, revealing the beautiful young woman she might have been under different circumstances. "You are not what I expected, Samuel Morrison," she said softly. Before Sam could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the cabin's single window, they could see a cloud of dust rising from the direction of town. Someone was coming, and coming fast. Sam's instincts, honed by years of surviving on the frontier, screamed danger. He moved to the window and peered out, his worst fears confirmed when he recognized the lead rider. Captain James Rourke sat his horse like the cavalry officer he was, straight-backed and confident. Behind him rode 4 men in army uniforms, their faces hard as desert stone. But it was the 5th rider that made Sam's blood run cold. Jake Sullivan, Blackwood's brutal foreman, wearing a smile that promised violence. "They're coming for you," Sam said, turning back to Elena. Her face had gone white as she recognized the approaching riders. "What do we do?" she whispered. Sam looked at her frightened face and made a decision that would end his 5 years of peace forever. Walking to his bedroom, he knelt beside the wooden chest beneath his bed and threw back the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the twin Colt .45s that had made him legend. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the familiar weight of the weapons, muscle memory flooding back despite the years. The guns felt like extensions of his soul, deadly, efficient, and hungry for justice. "Stay behind me," he told Elena, checking the loads in both cylinders. "And whatever happens, don't look back." Outside, Captain Rourke's voice rang out across the desert afternoon. "Morrison, We know you're in there. Come out and we can discuss this like civilized men." Sam stepped to the door, his guns riding low on his hips for the first time in 5 years. The weight felt strange and familiar all at once, like greeting an old friend you weren't sure you trusted anymore. "I'm afraid our business is concluded, Captain," Sam called back. "The girl's contract has been legally fulfilled." Rourke's laughter carried on the desert wind. "Oh, I think you'll find there's been a clerical error, Morrison. Seems Miss Vasquez here is wanted for theft and assault back in Tucson. We're here to arrest her." It was a lie, of course, but a legal fiction that would give Rourke all the excuse he needed. Sam's hands moved to hover over his gun butts, the familiar stance feeling like coming home after a long journey. Behind him, Elena whispered a prayer in Spanish. Ahead of him, 5 armed men prepared to take by force what they couldn't obtain through legal channels. And somewhere in between, Samuel Morrison prepared to discover whether 5 years of peace had dulled the edge that once made him the deadliest man in the Arizona territory. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust devils between Sam's cabin and the 5 mounted men who'd come to collect their prize. Elena pressed herself against the cabin wall, her breathing shallow and rapid as she watched Sam's transformation from peaceful blacksmith to something far more dangerous. "You've got 60 seconds to send the girl out, Morrison," Captain Rourke called, his hand resting casually on his cavalry saber. "After that, we come in shooting." Sam stepped onto his front porch, the wooden boards creaking under his boots. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long and dark across the dusty yard, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt the familiar calm that preceded violence, that strange peace that came when all choices narrowed down to survival. "I count 5 of you," Sam said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Seems like overkill for one unarmed girl." Jake Sullivan spat tobacco juice into the dirt, his scarred face twisted with anticipation. "Should have minded your own business, blacksmith. Now you're going to learn what happens to folks who interfere with Mr. Blackwood's operations." "Funny thing about learning," Sam replied, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Sometimes the teacher becomes the student real quick." Rourke raised his hand, signaling his men to spread out in a classic flanking formation. The captain was no fool. He'd heard the stories about Deadeye Morrison and wasn't taking any chances. 2 soldiers moved to the left, 2 to the right, while Rourke and Sullivan remained in the center. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, Morrison," Rourke said. "Surrender now and maybe you live through this." "Maybe," Sam agreed, "but probably not." The words hung in the desert air like the moment before lightning strikes. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elena watched from the cabin doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs as she witnessed something she'd only heard about in whispered legends, the moment when a gunfighter faced his destiny. It was Sullivan who broke first, his hand darting toward his pistol with the practiced speed of a man who'd killed before. But Sullivan had spent his years bullying farmers and intimidating townspeople, not facing down professional killers in fair fights. Sam's right hand moved like striking lightning, the Colt clearing leather and firing before Sullivan's gun had traveled halfway out of its holster. The bullet took the foreman's center mass, spinning him out of his saddle to land face first in the dust, his unfired weapon clattering uselessly beside his still body. The soldiers reacted with military precision, spurring their horses forward while drawing their weapons. But Sam was already moving, rolling left behind a wooden water trough as their shot splintered the porch where he'd been standing. "Take him alive if possible," Rourke shouted, but his words were lost in the thunder of gunfire. The soldier on Sam's right, a young corporal with fear-widened eyes, fired too quickly, his shot going wide. Sam's return shot didn't miss, catching the boy in the shoulder and spinning him from his mount with a cry of pain. A bullet whined past Sam's ear as one of the flanking soldiers found his range. The former gunfighter threw himself behind his woodpile, feeling splinters explode around him. His mind calculated angles and distances with the cold precision that had once made him legendary. "Elena!" he called without taking his eyes off the enemy. "There's a rifle behind the door. Can you use it?" "See," came her immediate reply. "My father taught me to hunt." The remaining mounted soldiers were closing in from both sides, trying to catch Sam in a crossfire. But the woodpile provided good cover and Sam had faced worse odds before. Much worse. He broke cover suddenly, sprinting toward the stable while firing with both guns. The unexpected charge caught the soldiers off guard. Most men would have stayed hidden, not charged directly into enemy fire. Sam's left-hand gun barked, and another soldier tumbled from his horse clutching a wounded arm. A rifle cracked from the cabin doorway. Elena had found his Winchester and put it to good use. Her shot missed, but it forced Captain Rourke to dive from his saddle, seeking cover behind a scrubby mesquite bush. Now it was down to Sam, Rourke, and 2 wounded soldiers. The odds were getting better, but Sam knew the hardest part was just beginning. Rourke hadn't survived the Apache Wars by being careless or stupid. "Impressive shooting, Morrison," Rourke called from his meager cover. "But you're still outnumbered." "Been outnumbered before," Sam replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "Usually works out better for me than the other fellers." The wounded corporal was trying to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. The other injured soldier had managed to take cover behind his dead horse, but his shooting arm hung useless at his side. That left Rourke as the primary threat. Experienced, desperate, and with nothing left to lose. "Tell you what, Morrison," the captain called. "You've made your point. Keep the girl. We'll call it even and ride out of here." "Now, why would I trust a man who came here to kidnap an innocent woman?" Sam replied, watching for movement behind the mesquite. "Because I'm offering you the chance to live. Living ain't always the most important thing, Captain." Rourke's response was a sudden burst of movement, the cavalry officer rolling from his cover while firing his service revolver. The man was fast, faster than Sam had expected. One bullet tugged at Sam's sleeve, another kicked up dust near his boots. But Sam had been in more gunfights than he could count, and his return fire was devastatingly accurate. Both Colts spoke simultaneously, their reports echoing off the desert hills like thunder. Rourke stumbled, dropped his weapon, and fell to his knees in the dusty yard. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the labored breathing of wounded men and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Sam kept his guns trained on the surviving soldiers until he was certain they posed no further threat. "It's over," he called to Elena, who emerged from the cabin with the rifle still clutched in her hands. Her face was pale but determined, and Sam felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Captain Rourke was still alive but badly hurt, blood spreading across his blue uniform tunic. He looked up at Sam with pain-filled eyes that held no hint of surrender. You have no idea what you've done," he gasped. "Blackwood won't let this stand. He'll bring the whole territorial government down on you." "Let him try," Sam said quietly. "I'm tired of running from men like you. The girl, she's worth more than you know. There are buyers, in California, who pay premium prices for—" Sam's boot connected with Rourke's jaw, cutting off the vile words. The captain slumped unconscious in the dirt, and Sam felt no satisfaction from the violence, only a deep weariness that came from stepping back into a world he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Elena approached slowly, her eyes taking in the carnage spread across what had been a peaceful homestead just minutes before. "Is it finished?" "This part is," Sam said, holstering his weapons. "But Rourke was right about one thing. Blackwood won't let this go. We've made powerful enemies today." "We?" Elena's eyebrows rose. "You still think of us as we after all this?" Sam looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the shooting started. Despite everything she'd endured, Elena Vasquez stood tall and unbroken, her dark eyes blazing with the same defiant spirit that had first caught his attention at the auction. She reminded him not just of his sister Maria, but of the best parts of himself that he'd thought lost forever. "If you'll have a broken-down ex-gunfighter as a partner," he said, "because staying in Redemption Ridge isn't an option anymore. Not for either of us." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying his weathered face. Then she smiled, not the bitter expression from before, but something warm and genuine that transformed her features. "Where will we go?" "West," Sam said, looking toward the distant mountains where the sun was beginning to set. "California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere Blackwood's influence doesn't reach." "And what will we do when we get there?" Sam considered the question seriously. His reputation would follow him wherever he went, and Elena's beauty would always attract the wrong kind of attention. They'd need to be careful, smart, and probably ready to fight again before their story was finished. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. Together. As the desert wind picked up again, swirling dust around the bodies of their enemies, Sam Morrison and Elena Vasquez began gathering supplies for a journey that would take them far from the blood-soaked yard of an Arizona cabin. Behind them lay the wreckage of their old lives. Ahead waited an uncertain future in a harsh and unforgiving land. But for the first time in 5 years, Sam felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. He'd broken his oath never to kill again, but in doing so, he'd honored a deeper promise, one made at his sister's graveside to protect the innocent. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to balance the scales of his conscience. The sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the desert, carrying news of the day's violence back to Theodore Blackwood and his empire of corruption. But Samuel Morrison no longer cared about powerful men and their schemes. He had found his redemption in the most unlikely place, not in 5 years of peaceful blacksmithing, but in 30 seconds of righteous violence that had freed them both from the chains of their past. Together, they rode into the gathering darkness, leaving Redemption Ridge far behind as they began the long journey toward whatever destiny awaited them in the vast American West. What did you think of Samuel Morrison's journey from peaceful blacksmith back to legendary gunfighter? Did his choice to break his sacred oath feel justified, or should he have found another way to save Elena? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your takes on these classic Western tales of redemption and justice. If you enjoyed this story of courage in the face of corruption, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales from the American frontier. Your support helps me bring these epic stories to life. And trust me, we've got plenty more adventures waiting in the dusty trails ahead. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when the next story drops.